Good evening, friends. Today I want to share with you the keys to living a victorious life. Not just any victory, but a victorious life that is rooted in the promises of God, one that is led by His strength, and one that brings glory to His name. I want to draw from the life of Joshua, a man who, by God's grace, led Israel to one of the greatest victories in history. His journey holds the keys we need to live victorious lives in our own day. The first key to a victorious life is courage. Courage is the foundation upon which victory is built. Without courage, we would never move forward, never take the first step, never dare to rise above the challenges that life throws our way. Just as Joshua stood at the brink of the promised land, facing giants and fortified cities, each one of us stands at the threshold of our own battles, waiting to step forward. It's easy to be overwhelmed by the unknown, to look at the obstacles before us and think that they are too big, too powerful, too daunting to overcome. But courage is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to act in the face of fear. Joshua didn't have the luxury of knowing how things would turn out. He didn't know if the walls of Jericho would fall or if the people would conquer the land that God had promised. But he trusted God's calling, and he moved forward, courageously taking steps into the unknown. But courage is not something that comes naturally to most of us. It requires faith, strength, and trust in something greater than ourselves. We live in a world that often tempts us to shrink back, to play it safe, to remain in the comfort zone. But if we want to live victorious lives, we must learn to take risks, to face our fears, and to do the hard things. Courage is a choice we make each day, and it is a decision to place our trust in God. Joshua knew that his strength didn't come from his own abilities, his own skills, or his own understanding. His courage was drawn from his trust in God. The moment God spoke to him and commissioned him to lead the Israelites into the promised land, Joshua's courage wasn't rooted in what he saw or understood. It was rooted in the fact that the Creator of the universe had called him to this task, and he knew that God would not abandon him. When God says to Joshua, "Be strong and courageous," it is not just an encouragement, it is a command. God is telling Joshua to take courage because He, the Almighty, is with him. That same promise is extended to each of us today. We are never called to face anything alone. God is with us in every battle, every trial, and every moment of uncertainty. His presence is our strength, and that is the foundation of true courage. Courage is also about the willingness to stand firm in our convictions, even when it is unpopular. Joshua could have listened to the doubts and fears of the people around him. He could have been intimidated by the mighty cities and powerful kings that lay ahead, but he didn't. Joshua chose to stand firm in his trust in God. He was unwavering in his belief that the God who had parted the Red Sea, who had led them through the wilderness, was the same God who would give them victory in the promised land. We live in a world that will often challenge our beliefs, our values, and our faith. It will push us to conform, to compromise, and to shrink back from standing for what is right. But courage is the strength to stand firm in our faith, even when it costs us something. When we live with courage, we show the world that we trust God more than the opinions of others, more than the fears that threaten to hold us back. Courage is also the ability to step out even when we don't have all the answers. Joshua didn't know exactly how the Israelites would defeat the inhabitants of the land. God didn't give him a detailed roadmap. Instead, He gave him a promise, and that was enough. Many times we face situations in life where we don't have all the answers, where the future seems uncertain and unclear, but God calls us to move forward anyway. He calls us to take one step at a time, to trust that He will guide us as we go. Courage doesn't mean having everything figured out. It means trusting God enough to take that first step and trusting that He will lead us the rest of the way. It is through courage that we break free from the chains of fear and self-doubt. Joshua had the courage to rise above the limitations of his own understanding and ability. He wasn't a perfect leader, but he had a perfect God leading him. When we trust in God's power rather than our own, we find that there is nothing we cannot face. With courage, we can overcome the giants in our lives, whether they are fears, doubts, or external obstacles. Ultimately, courage is a testimony of our faith in God. It is a declaration that we believe His promises are true, that He is who He says He is, and that He will do what He has promised to do. Just as God was with Joshua, He is with us today. He calls us to rise, to move forward, and to step into the victory He has already prepared for us. Victory doesn't come to those who sit idly by or who shrink back in fear. It comes to those who, like Joshua, have the courage to face the giants, to march forward in faith, and to trust that God will lead them to the victory He has promised. In your life, there will be moments when you feel unsure, when fear tries to take hold, when the road ahead looks too difficult to navigate. But remember this: courage is not the absence of fear, it is the strength to move forward despite it. And with God on your side, you can face any challenge and claim the victory that He has prepared for you. Let your courage be a witness to the world of the God you serve and the faith you hold. Rise up with courage, for victory is waiting on the other side of your faith. The second key to a victorious life is obedience. Obedience is often seen as a simple act of following instructions, but in the context of a victorious life, it is much more than that. Obedience is an act of trust, a commitment to God's will, and a recognition that His wisdom far exceeds our own. When Joshua was called to lead the Israelites into the Promised Land, it was not a journey that he could undertake on his own strength. It was a journey that required unwavering obedience to God's commands. The very first thing that God told Joshua was to be strong and courageous. But then He also made it clear that the key to success was obedience to His law. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Joshua 1:8. This command was not just for Joshua. It was for every believer. Victory comes not through our own efforts or plans, but through our obedience to God's word. God does not call us to walk in our own ways, but to walk in His ways. And obedience is the pathway that leads us to victory. Joshua's victory was tied to his willingness to obey God's directions, even when they seemed strange or illogical. Take, for instance, the Battle of Jericho. God instructed Joshua to have the Israelites march around the city once a day for 6 days, and then on the seventh day to march around it 7 times and shout. On the surface, this plan may have seemed irrational. The Israelites were not trained in siege warfare, and the walls of Jericho were formidable, but Joshua did not question God. He obeyed, even when the strategy defied human logic. And because of his obedience, the walls of Jericho fell down. This event is a clear demonstration that God's ways are not always our ways, and His plans are often beyond our understanding. Obedience to God's commands, even when they don't make sense to us, is a crucial part of walking in victory. God doesn't need us to understand His plans. He simply needs us to trust and obey. Obedience, however, is not just about following God's commands when they are easy or when they align with our desires. It is about following Him even when it is hard, even when it requires sacrifice, and even when we don't understand the reason behind His instructions. Joshua had to lead the people into the Promised Land, and there were many obstacles along the way. There were cities to conquer, armies to defeat, and challenges to overcome. But through it all, Joshua's obedience remained steadfast. When we face challenges, our immediate response is often to question, to doubt, or to resist. We want to take control and do things our way, but God calls us to a higher standard. True victory comes when we surrender our own understanding and choose to trust God completely. The Israelites' obedience was also tested in their commitment to follow God's word fully, not partially. After they defeated Jericho, they were instructed to take nothing from the city. Everything was to be devoted to the Lord. Yet one man, Cahn, disobeyed this command and took some of the spoils for himself. His disobedience resulted in defeat for the Israelites in their next battle at Ai. This tragic event shows us that partial obedience is still disobedience. God is not interested in half-hearted obedience. He calls us to follow Him fully without holding anything back. In our own lives, we must ask ourselves if we are fully surrendering to God's will or if we are holding on to areas where we want to control the outcome. Victory comes when we lay down our own desires and submit ourselves completely to God's plans. One of the greatest challenges to obedience is the temptation to follow our own desires or to listen to the voices of those around us who may not have God's best interest in mind. Joshua could have easily been swayed by the complaints of the Israelites, or by the fear and doubt that often plagued their journey. But he remained obedient to God's instructions, even when the people grumbled or questioned him. Obedience requires a singular focus on God's word, regardless of the external pressures we face. In a world full of distractions, it is easy to listen to the opinions of others, or to let fear and doubt lead us astray. But obedience requires that we tune our hearts to God's voice and follow His lead, even when it is difficult. There are moments in our lives when obedience to God will be tested. It may come in the form of a difficult decision, a challenging circumstance, or a moment of uncertainty. But it is in those moments that our true faith is revealed. Obedience is not about doing what is easy. It is about doing what is right in God's eyes, regardless of the cost. God's instructions to us may not always be clear or easy to follow, but He promises that His ways are always the best ways. When we obey, we align ourselves with His will and invite His blessing into our lives. Just as Joshua saw victory in the promised land through his obedience, we too can experience the fullness of God's promises when we choose to follow His word. In our journey toward victory, we must remember that obedience is not a one-time event. It is a daily choice. Every day we are faced with decisions that challenge our commitment to follow God's word. But each time we choose obedience, we take one more step toward the victory that God has promised us. Obedience is a key that unlocks the door to God's blessings. And it is through obedience that we experience the fullness of His presence and power in our lives. We do not obey for the sake of rules or rituals. We obey because we love God and trust that His plans for us are good. And as we walk in obedience, we will find ourselves moving closer to the victorious life that He has prepared for us. The third key to a victorious life is faith. Faith is the foundation upon which all victory is built. And without it, victory becomes an elusive dream. Just as Joshua trusted in the promises of God, so too must we. The faith that Joshua exhibited was not merely belief in a distant, theoretical God. It was a deep, unwavering trust in the living God who had proven His faithfulness time and time again. Faith is the conviction that God is who He says He is and that He will do what He has promised. When God called Joshua to lead the Israelites into the Promised Land, He was asking him to believe in a future that had not yet been realized, to trust in a victory that was yet to be seen. But Joshua didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, not because of his own abilities, but because of his unwavering trust in the God who had called him. The victory that Joshua experienced was a direct result of his faith in God's promises. It is through faith that we are able to rise above our fears, our doubts, and our circumstances. Faith empowers us to look beyond the immediate obstacles and to see the victory that God has already prepared for us. Faith, however, is not something that comes easily or automatically. It requires a conscious decision to trust in God, even when the circumstances of life do not align with what we expect or hope for. Faith is most often tested in times of trial, difficulty, and uncertainty. It is during these moments that our true faith is revealed. Joshua faced countless obstacles in his journey. The cities were fortified, the armies were strong, and the land was filled with enemies. But none of these challenges caused Joshua to waver in his faith. He held on to the promise that God had given him. Every place where you set your foot, I will give you. Joshua believed that God would keep His word, even when everything around him suggested otherwise. In our own lives, we too are called to trust God's promises, even when they seem impossible or when the path ahead is unclear. It is easy to trust God when everything is going well, but true faith is displayed when we continue to trust Him in the face of hardship. It is in the valley that our faith grows deeper and our trust in God becomes stronger. Faith requires a shift in perspective. It means choosing to see our circumstances through the lens of God's promises rather than through our own understanding. Joshua's faith was not based on what he could see or understand. It was based on what God had spoken. God promised that He would be with Joshua, just as He had been with Moses. And Joshua believed that promise, even though he had never seen the fulfillment of it in his own life. Our faith, too, must be rooted in the promises of God, and not in what we can see with our physical eyes. When we place our faith in God's word, we align ourselves with his will and step into the victory he has promised. Faith is not about denying the reality of the challenges we face. It is about acknowledging that God is greater than any obstacle and that his power is more than sufficient to overcome anything that stands in our way. Faith also requires action. True faith is not passive, it is active, and it requires movement. Joshua's faith wasn't just belief in a promise, it was belief that led to action. When God commanded Joshua to march around the walls of Jericho, Joshua didn't hesitate. He trusted that God's plan, no matter how unconventional it seemed, would lead to victory. It was through the action of marching, by stepping out in faith, that the walls of Jericho came down. Faith requires us to act on what we believe. It calls us to move forward, to take the first step, even when the path ahead is unclear. God doesn't always give us the full picture of what the future holds, but he calls us to trust him with what we know and to step out in faith. When we choose to act on our faith, we are trusting that God will meet us where we are and lead us to the victory he has promised. One of the most powerful aspects of faith is its ability to inspire others. Joshua's faith did not just impact his own life, it impacted the entire nation of Israel. When Joshua walked in faith, the people of Israel followed his example. Their victory was not just the result of one man's faith, it was the result of a nation of people who chose to believe in the promises of God. Faith is contagious. When we live by faith, others are encouraged to do the same. Our trust in God becomes a testimony of his faithfulness, and it inspires others to trust him as well. As we walk in faith, we become a living testimony to the power of God's promises, and we draw others into the victory that he has for them as well. Faith is also about waiting on God's timing. Joshua and the Israelites didn't conquer the promised land immediately. There was a period of waiting and preparation. But during this time, their faith was being built. Waiting is one of the hardest aspects of faith, but it is also one of the most important. God's timing is always perfect, and he uses times of waiting to prepare us for the victory ahead. During these waiting periods, God is refining our faith, strengthening our trust in him, and preparing us to step into the next season of victory. When we learn to wait with faith, we are demonstrating that we trust God's plan for our lives, even when we don't yet see the outcome. Ultimately, faith is the key that unlocks the door to victory. It is the belief that God is faithful, that his promises are true, and that he is able to do far more than we can ask or imagine. Just as Joshua placed his faith in God and experienced victory, we too can experience the victory that God has prepared for us when we place our trust in him. Faith is the foundation of every victory, and it is through faith that we step into the fullness of God's promises. The fourth key to a victorious life is perseverance. Perseverance is the ability to continue moving forward even when the path is difficult, when the obstacles seem insurmountable, and when the end goal appears out of reach. Joshua's journey into the Promised Land was not a smooth, uninterrupted success. It was filled with trials, challenges, and moments of doubt. But through it all, Joshua demonstrated a crucial element of victory. He pressed on despite the setbacks, remained faithful in the face of discouragement, and continued to trust God's promise that the land would be given to the Israelites. His perseverance was not just about surviving, it was about continuing to trust in God's faithfulness and pushing forward toward the goal, no matter how long it took or how hard it became. Perseverance is not merely enduring the tough times, it is maintaining a spirit of faith and determination, trusting that God will bring the victory in his timing. In the story of Joshua and the Israelites, we see that perseverance was key to their eventual victory. The journey into the Promised Land was long and filled with battles. Some battles were won with miraculous interventions, such as the fall of Jericho, but others were won through grit, determination, and faithfulness to God. It was the perseverance of the people of Israel under Joshua's leadership that led them to victory. There were times when they faced defeat, when they had to regroup and adjust their strategy, but they did not give up. They kept moving forward. Joshua led them with a vision of what God had promised them, and even when things seemed impossible, he kept urging them to press on. His example of perseverance is one that challenges us to continue, no matter how difficult the journey may seem. Perseverance is about holding on to the promises of God, even when circumstances try to tell us otherwise. Joshua and the Israelites had been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years before they reached the edge of the promised land. During those years, they faced hunger, thirst, and hardship. They dealt with rebellion, disobedience, and moments of hopelessness. Yet through all these challenges, Joshua remained committed to the vision of God's promise. He never lost sight of what lay ahead. How easy it would have been for him to grow weary and question the promise that had been given to him and to the people. But Joshua understood that perseverance was the key to seeing that promise fulfilled. When faced with overwhelming odds, perseverance allowed him to keep pushing forward, knowing that the battle was not his to fight alone, but God's. This is a powerful lesson for us. When we persevere, we are not relying on our own strength or ability. We are trusting in God's ability to bring us through and to fulfill His promises. Our perseverance is a testimony that we believe God will see us through, no matter how tough the journey becomes. Perseverance also requires patience. We often want things to happen quickly and on our own timeline, but God's timing is always perfect. Joshua's journey into the Promised Land did not happen overnight. There were long years of waiting and trusting before they reached the fulfillment of God's promise. The same is true for our lives. There will be times when we feel like we are not making progress, when we face delays, or when things seem to move at a slow pace. But perseverance is not about rushing the process. It is about trusting that God is working, even when we cannot see it. God's timing is always better than our own, and when we learn to persevere with patience, we align ourselves with His plan for our lives. Sometimes the delays we experience are not setbacks, but are part of God's process of preparing us for what lies ahead. Perseverance requires that we trust God's timing and remain faithful in the waiting. Moreover, perseverance involves a mindset that refuses to give up, no matter how many setbacks we face. Joshua faced many challenges on the journey to the Promised Land, including fierce battles with enemy nations and internal struggles with the Israelites themselves. Yet, in the face of these difficulties, he kept his focus on the goal. He didn't allow the setbacks to derail his mission or to shake his faith. There were moments when it would have been easy for Joshua to give in to fear, to let the obstacles overwhelm him, but he refused. He chose to keep moving forward. Perseverance is not just about enduring. It is about choosing to move ahead, to keep fighting, and to stay committed to the mission God has given us. Life will throw many challenges our way, but it is the refusal to quit that will ultimately lead us to victory. Perseverance also requires strength in the face of opposition. Joshua did not face the challenges alone. He led an entire nation through difficult battles, and at times the pressure could have been overwhelming. Yet through it all, he remained steadfast. He took God at His word and believed that, with God's help, victory would come. The challenges Joshua faced were not just external, they were also internal. There were times when the people of Israel doubted, complained, and struggled with obedience. Joshua's perseverance was tested not only by external battles, but also by the internal struggles of the people he led. Despite these difficulties, Joshua kept his focus on God's promise and continued to lead with courage and faithfulness. As we persevere in our own lives, we will face both external and internal battles. There will be times when others question our decisions, or when we feel exhausted and discouraged. But perseverance calls us to press on, even when the road ahead seems uncertain. It calls us to keep going, to keep trusting in God, and to keep moving forward toward the victory that He has promised. In the end, perseverance leads to victory. Joshua and the Israelites eventually conquered the Promised Land. But it was not an easy journey. It required unwavering faith, obedience, and most of all, perseverance. When we face difficulties and setbacks in our own lives, we must remember that perseverance is key to achieving the victory God has promised. It is through perseverance that we learn to trust God more deeply, to depend on His strength, and to remain faithful to His calling. Victory doesn't come to those who give up at the first sign of trouble. It comes to those who continue to press on, no matter how difficult the journey may be. When we persevere, we are honoring God's promise and aligning ourselves with His plan for our lives. Just as Joshua saw the fulfillment of God's promise, after years of perseverance, we too can expect to see the victory that God has promised when we remain faithful and continue to press on. The fifth key to a victorious life is courage. Courage is the inner strength that enables us to face challenges, take risks, and stand firm in our faith, even in the face of fear. When Joshua was called by God to lead the Israelites into the Promised Land, he was faced with a monumental task. He had to guide an entire nation into uncharted territory, confront formidable enemies, and overcome overwhelming odds. In this process, courage was not optional. It was essential. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. It is a bold, unwavering commitment to move forward, even when the way ahead seems uncertain or dangerous. Joshua exemplified this kind of courage throughout his leadership. God repeatedly commanded him to be strong and courageous, knowing that this would be the only way he could fulfill the task ahead. Joshua's courage was rooted in his trust in God, not in his own abilities. When we are called to step into our own promised land, we too must draw on courage. The courage that comes from knowing that God is with us and that His power is greater than any obstacle. Courage is often needed when we are faced with the unknown. When Joshua took the Israelites into the land of Canaan, they were stepping into a world that was unfamiliar, dangerous, and filled with enemies. The challenges they faced were beyond their ability to overcome on their own. Yet God told Joshua, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Joshua 1:9. These words were not only a command, but also a promise. Courage is not based on our own understanding of the situation, but on the assurance that God's presence will guide us through. Joshua's courage did not come from the certainty of success or from a clear, easy path. It came from his conviction that God was with him every step of the way. Similarly, when we face the unknown in our own lives, we must find our courage in the same place, God's presence. It is through His presence that we gain the courage to move forward, even when the future is unclear. Courage is also necessary when we face opposition. Throughout Joshua's journey, he encountered numerous enemies who sought to prevent the Israelites from taking possession of the land. The people of Canaan were strong, their cities were fortified, and the battle seemed insurmountable. Yet, Joshua did not allow fear or doubt to overtake him. He faced these challenges head on, trusting that God would give him the victory. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to stand firm in the face of fear and continue pressing forward. The Israelites' victories in the Promised Land were not a result of their own strength or military prowess, but because they had the courage to trust in God and follow His commands, even when it seemed impossible. In our own lives, we too will face opposition. There will be times when we encounter resistance, whether from people, circumstances, or our own fears. But it is in those moments that courage becomes crucial. We must choose to trust God and step forward, even when opposition seems overwhelming. Courage gives us the strength to do what is right, even when it is difficult or unpopular. Courage also requires the ability to make difficult decisions. Throughout his leadership, Joshua was faced with critical decisions that affected the future of the entire nation. These decisions were not always easy, and often they required him to act in ways that went against conventional wisdom or the desires of the people. For example, when the Israelites were instructed to completely destroy certain cities, including Jericho, the decision was not one that would have been easy for Joshua to make. But courage allowed him to follow God's command, knowing that it was part of God's larger plan. Sometimes, courage means making tough decisions that may not be understood by everyone around us, but are necessary for the fulfillment of God's will. In our own lives, we will face moments where we must make difficult decisions, choices that require us to stand firm in our faith and trust in God's guidance. Courage enables us to make those decisions with confidence, knowing that God's will is greater than our understanding. Another aspect of courage is the willingness to step into leadership. Joshua was called to lead a nation, and with that responsibility came tremendous pressure. He could have easily shrunk back, doubting his ability to lead, questioning whether he was truly capable of fulfilling the task ahead. But courage compelled him to step into his calling. He understood that leadership required not just skill and intelligence, but also boldness and trust in God. It takes courage to step into leadership, whether in our families, our communities, or in the workplace. Courage is needed to make decisions that impact others, to stand for what is right, and to lead by example. In Joshua's case, his courage to lead the Israelites into the Promised Land inspired the people to follow him. In our own lives, we are often called to lead in some capacity, whether it's leading our families, our teams, or our communities. Courage gives us the strength to take on these responsibilities, knowing that God equips us for every task he calls us to. Courage also requires the ability to face failure and continue moving forward. Joshua did not experience victory in every battle at first. There were moments of defeat, such as the loss at Ai after the sin of Achan. But Joshua did not allow these setbacks to cause him to give up. Instead, he sought God, repented for the sin, and pressed on. Courage is not just about succeeding. It is about continuing to move forward in faith, even when we experience setbacks or failure. Life is full of challenges, and we may encounter times when things don't go as planned. But it is in those moments that courage becomes even more important. Courage enables us to rise again, to learn from our mistakes, and to keep moving forward with renewed determination. It is not the absence of failure that defines a victorious life, but the willingness to keep moving forward, trusting that God's grace will empower us to succeed in the end. Courage is the fuel that propels us forward in our journey toward victory. It is the strength to act in the face of fear, to stand firm when opposition arises, to make difficult decisions, to lead with confidence, and to continue moving forward in the face of failure. Just as Joshua's courage enabled him to lead the Israelites into the Promised Land, our courage enables us to step into the fullness of God's promises for our lives. God calls us to be strong and courageous, not in our own strength, but in the strength that comes from knowing He is with us. When we have the courage to trust in God and follow His call, we can be assured that He will lead us to victory. Courage is not just about facing the external battles, but also about overcoming the internal struggles, the fears, doubts, and insecurities that hold us back. With courage, we can press forward into the life of victory that God has prepared for us. The sixth key to a victorious life is obedience. Obedience to God's commands is the essential foundation upon which victory is built. Throughout the life of Joshua, we see that obedience to God was the determining factor in the success of his leadership and the prosperity of the Israelites. From the very beginning of his calling, Joshua was instructed to be obedient to the Lord's guidance, to follow His commands precisely, and to trust in His wisdom above all else. The Israelites' journey into the Promised Land was not simply a matter of military strategy or personal strength. It was a matter of aligning their actions with God's will. Joshua understood that obedience to God's instructions was not just a suggestion, it was a mandate for success. His obedience and the obedience of the people he led was directly linked to their ability to conquer the land and fulfill God's promises. This obedience wasn't just about following rules, it was about submitting to God's plan and recognizing that His way is the best and only way. When God told Joshua to march around Jericho 7 times, to keep silent, and then to shout, it was a command that didn't make sense by human standards. But Joshua obeyed without question, and the walls of Jericho fell. It was through such obedience that the Israelites experienced the breakthrough they needed to move forward. Obedience requires trust. When God commands us to do something, it often challenges our understanding, our preferences, and our own sense of timing. We may not always understand why God asks us to do certain things, but obedience requires that we trust His wisdom. Joshua demonstrated a deep trust in God, understanding that God's ways are higher than human understanding. In his obedience, Joshua didn't just follow God's commands because they made sense. He followed them because he knew that God was trustworthy and that His plans were always for the good of the people. Obedience to God is not about understanding every detail of the plan, but about trusting that He knows what is best for us. Joshua's trust in God was evident in his actions. When God told him to take possession of the land, he didn't hesitate, even though the task seemed impossible. His obedience was rooted in a deep faith that God would fulfill His promises. Obedience is also a demonstration of love. Jesus said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." John 14:15. Obedience is the fruit of a heart that loves God and desires to honor Him above all else. For Joshua, his obedience to God was a reflection of his love for the Lord. It wasn't about mere duty. It was about his relationship with God. When we truly love God, our desire to obey Him becomes the natural response. We don't obey God out of fear or obligation, but out of a deep love for Him and a desire to see His will accomplished in our lives. Joshua's love for God was displayed through his unwavering commitment to follow God's commands, even when it meant stepping into the unknown or facing opposition. Obedience rooted in love leads to a deeper intimacy with God, and it positions us to experience His blessings in ways we could never imagine. Obedience also leads to blessings. God's commands are not burdensome or meant to limit us. They are meant to protect us and lead us into His best for our lives. Throughout the book of Joshua, we see that whenever the Israelites were obedient to God's instructions, they experienced His blessing. In contrast, when they disobeyed or followed their own desires, they faced consequences. Achan's actions led to defeat in the battle of Ai, and it was only when the sin was dealt with that Israel experienced victory once again. This highlights the reality that disobedience opens the door to defeat, while obedience opens the door to victory. Obedience places us in a position to receive God's blessings because it aligns us with His will. God's blessings flow when we live in harmony with His commands, and obedience allows us to experience His favor in ways that disobedience will never bring. Furthermore, obedience to God's commands is not just about individual action, it is about collective action. Joshua didn't just lead by example, he also called the people to obedience. He understood that the success of the mission depended on the collective obedience of the entire nation. When Joshua led the Israelites into the Promised Land, he emphasized the importance of following God's instructions together as a community. The Israelites' success was not dependent on the obedience of one individual, but on the obedience of the nation as a whole. Obedience is not just a personal matter, it is a communal one. As followers of Christ, we are called to live in obedience not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of the entire body of believers. Our obedience can inspire others, and when we collectively walk in obedience to God's commands, we experience His blessings on a greater scale. Obedience also requires humility. In order to obey God, we must humble ourselves and acknowledge that His ways are better than ours. Obedience is an act of surrender, of yielding our will to God's will. Joshua demonstrated this humility in his leadership. He didn't act on his own wisdom or strength. He sought God's direction and humbled himself before the Lord. Humility is essential for obedience because it removes our own pride and self-sufficiency, allowing us to fully rely on God. Without humility, we may be tempted to go our own way or rely on our own understanding. But obedience requires that we submit our will to God's, trusting that His plan is perfect and that His wisdom far exceeds our own. Joshua's success was not because of his own abilities, but because he humbled himself before God and submitted to His direction. As we walk in obedience, we must continually humble ourselves, recognizing that we are not the ones in control, but that God is the one who guides our steps. Obedience also requires perseverance. Obeying God's commands is not always easy, and it is not always a one-time act. Joshua's journey was one of constant obedience to God's direction, even when it meant facing battles, setbacks, and difficulties. There were moments when obedience seemed difficult, and there were times when the people of Israel struggled with their commitment to obey God. But Joshua remained persistent, and he encouraged the people to do the same. Obedience is not just about following God when it is easy or convenient. It is about continuing to obey Him even when it is challenging. It is a commitment to persevere in following His commands, knowing that the victory will come through our faithfulness and obedience. Joshua's ability to persevere in obedience was a key to his ultimate success. In the life of Joshua, we see that obedience is the path to victory. It is the foundation that allows us to experience God's blessings, to walk in his promises, and to fulfill the calling he has placed on our lives. Obedience is not always easy, but it is always worth it. When we choose to obey God, we are choosing to trust his wisdom, to honor him with our lives, and to align ourselves with his will. Obedience leads to blessings, to victory, and to a life that brings glory to God. Just as Joshua's obedience led the Israelites into the promised land, our obedience will lead us into the fullness of the life God has prepared for us. In conclusion, the Joshua keys to a victorious life are a powerful reminder of how faith, trust, perseverance, courage, and obedience can shape our journey toward the promises God has for us. Just as Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land, we too are called to step forward, knowing that with God's guidance and strength, we can overcome any obstacle. Let us be inspired by his example to walk boldly, trust deeply, and obey faithfully, believing that God will lead us to victory. May we remember that with God by our side, victory is always within reach.